Good morning, everybody. We're going to listen then, as Johnny beautifully prayed for us, that from these ancient words we might hear God's voice for us today, from Genesis 39, and I'm reading the first 6 verses. It's on page 43 if you're using the Bibles in front of you, but the words obviously will be on the screen. Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Thanks be to God for God's word to us. I understand that you are on the journey as we think about these words from this text this morning. We are in week 2 of 10 weeks. I'm a bit suspicious of Johnny's timing, having listened to the notices this morning, but I understand it's 10 weeks. Looking through the story of Joseph's story. And in many ways, over those 10 weeks, it's a bit of a roller coaster ride. And probably we won't hear some of these texts without the music of Andrew Lloyd Webber in the back of some of our minds. Joseph and his technicolor dream coat. Hopefully over 10 weeks, we'll learn a bit more about Joseph than just the fact he had nice clothes. But week 2 brings us to a particular moment, a particular turning point in the narrative. And I have to say, I feel uniquely unqualified to talk about the theme I've been given, a theme we're looking at this morning as we think about Joseph's story. This part of the roller coaster is thinking about Joseph, who goes from favoured son to forgotten slave. I feel uniquely unqualified, I have to say, because I'm the eldest of 2 in our family. I have a younger sister. So as anybody who is the eldest in their family knows, you are not the favoured as the eldest. It is always the youngest sibling who get the best of everything. I'm sure that is a universal experience. I don't know what it means to be the favoured son, if I'm honest. And I can't, with hand on heart, say I know truly what it means to be the forgotten slave. Sometimes things are tough in life, but there's no way I could say I'm a forgotten slave. And then when I look at the text that we heard this morning, and actually if I were to have read on, it says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. And I really know nothing about what that means at all. So I have to say, I feel like a bit of a fraud up here. And yet, thank goodness, it's Joseph's story and not mine that I'm asked to share with you. What we're doing this morning is working, I think, with the pattern that is set for us as we think about this whole narrative of Joseph. We're taking time to detect in the story where God has led Joseph, what it means for him to be on that roller coaster, to be the favoured son and the forgotten slave. And already just in these 6 verses we heard this morning, we begin to have the hints of what will come in the future. We heard the fall from grace, as it were, and we began to pick up on some of the pattern of what would come to be as the Lord blesses Joseph, as the Lord seems to make everything that Joseph touches turn to gold, almost, it seems. Joseph, who's led away from his people and his family, led to an alien land, led away from that favoured son status, finds himself at the start of these verses as one who's forgotten, as one who is under the authority of somebody else, somebody other than God. There's a dynamic in these verses. a dynamic that begins to change everything for us. And it comes in verse 2. Joseph taken down to Egypt. You hear the language that's all passive, all about stuff that happens to Joseph, taken down to Egypt. And Potiphar, this officer of Pharaoh, bought him from the Ishmaelites, another group who had captured him, who had brought him down. And then in verse 2, this hinge, this turning point on which everything begins to turn around. The Lord was with Joseph, we're told. He became successful. He was found in the house, and God begins to bless Joseph as a result. After all that's happened to Joseph, all that we've learned from the first week and all that we know of Joseph's story already, it's this turning point that I think for us this morning is the key thing. The Lord was with Joseph. It doesn't matter that he's not any longer in that place of being the favoured son. It doesn't matter, actually, the circumstances that he finds himself in. Those aren't going to define him. The Lord was with Joseph, we're told. And everything begins to flow from that knowledge. So today I want to explore with us what that might mean as we think about this text for ourselves. As we've come here this morning, or as we're watching online, we might not think of ourselves as being favoured children. We might not think of ourselves as being successful in the way that the world might define it. We might think instead we're struggling. We might feel more like we are forgotten or overlooked. We might feel that we're passive, as it were, caught up in things that we have no control over, all sorts of things that we face in our journeys at work and at home, and as we struggle to do our best to be God's people. And we might wonder, well, where is God in all of that? And I think what we're given this morning in this portrait of Joseph is a reminder that despite how it seems to us, that the Lord is with us. And it's that knowledge and what that looks like in us and through us that makes the difference for us. I want to help us then, perhaps just to take a step back as we begin. Joseph's story comes as a significant narrative in a bunch of other significant stories of the nation. Here in Genesis, in this book all about beginnings, we're given a whole load of other stories about some of the founding figures in the life of the nation. Great characters and heroes of the faith. And in some ways, Joseph's story is just put alongside people like Abraham. From Genesis chapter 12, we start to hear how God intervenes in the life of particular individuals and how God guides and leads, even with their faults and their failings. But here, in Genesis 39, we're given Joseph's story. And although it sits alongside those other stories, in other ways, it's quite different, quite unique. There's different emphases, different stresses in what we learn about Joseph. The setting, the tone is all different. Joseph is in slavery. Joseph is the forgotten son, not the favoured son here at this moment. He's under the rule of an alien power. He's living in the land of the oppressors. And he himself, as we heard in the story, becomes part of that very system that oppresses God's people. At the same moment, Joseph is presented as one who is able to trust God, who is able to be used by God, who, because of God's blessing, becomes a blessing to other people. But you heard how this blessing was used in the text. It was used to bolster the power, the wealth of the Egyptian masters, those who at that time were oppressing the nation. Joseph, incredibly in this story, becomes a blessing, yes, but it's really complex and really hard because he's compromised. He's living in a land that is not his own, under very different values that he himself would not have owned or wanted to be part of. And yet in the very act of trying to be faithful to God and to live out his calling, he's asked to proceed where he finds himself, to seek the prosperity of the city, as Johnny prayed for us here over Plymouth, in a land that he would not want to think of as home. Do you see what's happening? All the while in this story, those twin threads are being woven together. God calling Joseph somehow through all the machinations of the plot. God with Joseph in the desperation of being sold into slavery, in this next twist of finding himself in Egypt, then in this place where he finds himself on the payroll of the oppressor. And somehow the purposes of God working out through all of those things, even the choices that Joseph is asked to make, choices that he wouldn't of his own volition ever want to make. What we're told, I think, in this is that Joseph's story stands for something far bigger, far more important. It's not like a blog or a newspaper report of what's happening to this one individual. This is a story, I think, that's written for a wider audience. It's written, I think, for a group of people, faithful people, who knew what it was to try desperately to follow God's will in circumstances and in a time and place that was not hospitable to what God was asking them to do and to be. This is a text that I think is written for Christians who are meeting today in Russia, perhaps in places like Palestine, where they are trying to faithfully live out their trust in Jesus Christ and yet are part of a nation that is far from following what it is that God would want, where we are not seeing the kingdom values of justice and peace and love being lived out. How on earth do you remain faithful in such a time under such pressure? This is what the story is for people, dare I say it, like us, who are sometimes asked to think about what it means to live perhaps in workplaces, in homes, in neighbourhoods that is not always hospitable to what we would think of as Christian values. This is a text which challenges us to find ways to trust in Jesus, even though we might not feel comfortable sometimes with what it means to serve in the way we know we are asked to serve. If perhaps at work we find ourselves being asked to cut corners that we think are inappropriate, if we're asked to sign up to things that we do not feel are compatible to what it means to following Jesus, then this text and these texts are for us. Whenever we're asked to live out our faith in the light of Easter, and we meet oppression or injustice, or we find a challenge in what it means to share the gospel. These texts, the story of Joseph, comes as a powerful reminder that the Lord is with us through those things. And we're asked to faithfully put one foot in front of the other to test out where God is leading us next. If firstly we were asked to take a step back, then I think the next thing is to take a step forward into that portrait that we're given of Joseph. In the narrative today, we were reminded that it becomes clear to everybody in the story that Joseph is this hero figure because the Lord was with him. It becomes recognized, a bit like a ripple effect through others in the story, that God is blessing Joseph, that Joseph, through his trust and his willingness to trust whatever happens, it becomes the bearer of God's image. It's a striking picture in these few verses of the one who is enslaved, who becomes more free than anybody else in the story, as others begin to recognize that God is with this person in a powerful, tangible, visible way. In our local preachers and worship leaders meeting this week, as we gather from time to time in the life of this church and circuit, we asked each other a question that we hoped would challenge us as those who lead worship in this place. We asked ourselves, how would we want to be known? What would it we would want to be known by as we seek to live out our calling as disciples, yes, as leaders of worship, as preachers? How would we want to be known? And together we reflected what that meant for us. Some talked about being our authentic selves before the Lord. Some talked about love. Some talked about the desire that others would know that we have been with Christ, and that would reflect from us in how we were, in how we interacted, in who we were. But I wonder how we, each of us, would answer that question for ourselves this morning. How would we want to be known? How would we want to be recognized? If we think about Joseph's story, it wasn't that he was a favored son. It wasn't even that he was this forgotten slave. He was known by everybody in this story as one who the Lord was with, that God was moving powerfully with him. Any success, any good time, Joseph would put down to God's presence. Any difficulty, any hard circumstances, Joseph found encouragement to face because he knew that the Lord was with him. Think about how you would want to be known by those around you, by your friends, by your colleagues, by your neighbours, by those you serve as you volunteer or work in other places. What is it on your heart that you would really want to show for God? And what is it that gets in the way? Because for Joseph, there were all sorts of factors, things that might have blown him off course. His circumstances were well outside of his control. And yet none of that mattered, because as the author of Genesis writes, the Lord was with him. It was that truth that defined Joseph, nothing else. Of course, this portrait we have of Joseph is just one of many throughout Scripture. Of course, as we read Joseph, we're supposed to begin to think with the eyes of Easter faith. This is, if you like, a type, an example of how Jesus will come to be. What we see in these narratives, in the ebb and flow of all that's happening, is something reflecting the light of Jesus. Jesus who comes to show us really what it means to be outside of control, to be handed over to others, just as Joseph was, to really show what it means that the Lord was with him in the most extraordinary of ways. We're supposed to begin to think about the rest of the outflowing of what Jesus comes to do and to be. We're supposed to think of Philippians 2, where we learn what it means to empty ourselves so that God might, in God's way, fill us with everything we need to show the world that the Lord is with us, with them, with all. And I can't help but mention, I feel like I'm contractually obliged to mention this today. Today we celebrate in the Methodist Church Aldersgate Sunday. That might mean nothing to some of you, but it's a day in the year when we remember a particular moment in the life of John Wesley. John Wesley, who on the 24th of May found a particular experience of God that so took hold of him that it changed his life forever. Wesley, who at the end of his life, his last reported words were, "The best of all is that God is with us." Just as Joseph could say in his circumstances, and the writer of Genesis could say about Joseph, the Lord was with him. Wesley could say, because he knew the assurance of God's love for him, that was the very best thing in his life, in all his serving, his preaching, his discipleship, his giving. The very best thing was that God is with us. When we think about ourselves, and when we think about how we would want to be known, I wonder what it would look like if others saw us as one who the Lord was with. I wonder what it would look like to those around us and those we have influence over if others recognize that the Lord was with us in that most powerful of ways, so that whatever we were facing this morning or in this particular season of our lives, if you like, paled into insignificance compared to that truth. So that whenever we face times we might think of as success or blessing in our lives, we might recognize that for what it really is, as an opportunity to share what we've been given, as a way to become a blessing for God, for others around us. For Joseph, we are told, the Lord was with him, and it made all the difference in the world. As favoured son, as forgotten slave, it didn't matter. The Lord was with him. For Wesley, who found his heart strangely warmed by the knowledge that God's love was for him, that Christ had died for him, that Christ was raised for him, that his sins were forgiven. The best of all was that God was with him. And for us, as we think about what this story might mean, the Lord is with us. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord is with you. Thanks be to God. Amen.